Hello, readers by eyes and by ears. This is Marty Chen, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, we are starting a new Danmei series. Well, it's new for me, and that is going to be Stars of Chaos, also known as Sha Po Lang by Priest. We will begin with Volume 1, starting with the prologue. It is broken up into 4 arcs, so yes. I hope you all enjoy. I've never read this before, so it'll be just as new for me as it may be for many of you. Prologue. From the swaying tips of duckweed, fierce winds arise. Chapter 1. Borderlands. In the small border town of Yanhui, there was a hill known as General Slope. Despite its majestic name, it was, in reality, nothing more than a small mound of earth. Those with long necks could easily see over its crest. General Slope hadn't always existed. 14 years ago, the Black Iron Battalion, the number 1 armored cavalry of Great Liang, had embarked on the northern expedition and laid waste to the 18 barbarian tribes. It was said that they passed through Yanhui town on their march back to the capital. The victorious troops cast aside their battered armor and created this mound. After many years of being swept by sand and dust and battered by wind and rain, General Slope took form. General Slope was barren. No matter what seeds one sowed here, nothing could grow. Even weeds refused to thrive, and consequently, there wasn't even any brush behind which those who wished to carry on clandestine love affairs might hide. Such a bald patch of dirt was completely useless. The old folks of the town all agreed the place was cursed. The murderous crimes committed by the Black Iron Battalion were so severe that malevolent energy had accumulated and overwhelmed this bit of earth. In time, some idle troublemakers cooked up a whole series of chilling ghost stories about the Borderlands based on their words. Thus, by and by, people stopped going there. The sky was already darkening. Yet 10-year-old kids had run out to the base of General Slope. One was tall and thin, while the other was short and round. Paired together, the two of them looked like a bowl of chopsticks hurtling along. The tall, thin one was dressed like a girl, and only upon closer inspection did it become clear that he was, in fact, a boy. He was called Cao Nyangzi. When he was very young, a fortune teller declared that he had been destined to be born a girl. Since he had been reincarnated into the wrong body, there was a chance that heavens might recall his soul and recast him in a form that matched his destiny. Fearing he would die young, his family named him Lady and raised him as a girl. The short, round one was the youngest son of Butcher Ge. He was called Ge Pangxiao, and, living up to his name of Little Porker, his skin was coated in a faint but rich sheen of oil. The two of them craned their necks and peered over at General Slope. Recalling those hair-raising tales, neither of them dared draw any closer. Ge Pangxiao held a copper-plated field scope up to his eye. Straining his neck, he looked intently at General Slope. "The sun's already set, but he still has come down from the hill. My Da Ge is really, what's the word? Slamming the books hard." "It's hitting the books hard. But enough nonsense," Cao Nyangzi said. "Hurry up and hand over that scope." This sham of a girl played his role almost too well. It was just a pity that the way he played it left something to be desired. He was nothing like a well-bred young lady. Rather, he resembled nothing so much as a coarse shrew with a distant fondness for pinching people on those chicken claws of his. Every time he extended his crooked fingers, Ge Pangxiao's flabby flesh would begin aching dully in anticipation of an attack. He hurried to obediently offer the field scope to the other boy. "Be careful with that," he warned. "My dad'll beat me into mincemeat if we break it." The so-called field scope was a small hollow cylinder made of copper. It was engraved with an image of 5 bats and fitted with a crystal-clear disc of glass on the inside. Looking through this scope, one could determine the sex of a rabbit from over 10 kilometers away. Ge Pangxiao's field of scope was of unusually fine make, having been left to him by his grandfather, a former military scout. Cao Niangzi held it reverently in his hands for a long while before lifting it skyward to look up at the stars. It's so clear. Ge Pangxiao looked up as well and pointed. I know that one. That's the evening star. It's also called Chang Geng, the same as my Da Ge. Shen Shiliu taught us that before. Who are you calling your Da Ge? Cao Niangzi's lip curled. As if he pays you any mind. You're always following him around, sucking up to him and insisting he's your Da Ge. Honestly, it's embarrassing. Hey, wait. Isn't that him over there? Following Cao Niangzi's pointing finger, Ge Pangxiao saw the person he'd been waiting for. A youth with a sword in his hand and his head bowed was slowly making his way down General Slope. Suddenly, it was as if Ge Pangxiao no longer feared the ghosts. He burst forth like a ball of lightning, hollering, Da Ge! Da Ge! In his haste, he tripped at the bottom of General Slope and somersaulted into a heap, coming to a stop at the youth's feet. Ge Pangxiao lifted his grimy face, not even bothering to push himself up as he revealed a silly, flattering smile. The smile became a grimace as he said, Da Ge, I've been waiting for you all day. The youth named Chang Geng silently withdrew his foot from where he had nearly trodden on Ge Pangxiao. Whenever Chang Geng saw Ge Pangxiao, he felt a little amazed. Butcher Ge, who had slaughtered so many thousands of pigs, must have been born with a pair of eagle eyes. How else to explain how the man had managed to avoid butchering his own son for so many years? But Chang Geng had a steady nature and was unfailingly courteous. He kept his thoughts to himself and would never say something so unkind out loud. In a manner quite becoming of an older brother, Chang Geng helped Ge Pangxiao to his feet. Why are you running? He asked, dusting the younger boy off. Be careful you don't fall and hurt yourself. Were you looking for me? Chang Geng Da Ge, your dad's coming back with the others tomorrow. We don't have class either, so why don't we go goose feet snatching together? We could beat the snot out of that little monkey Li and the rest of his gang. Chang Geng's father was Company Commander Xu, but the two shared no blood relation. At the age of 2 or 3, Chang Geng had followed his widowed mother, Xu Niang, to the border to seek refuge with relatives, only for the pair to find themselves stranded. Said relatives had moved away long ago. It just so happened that Company Commander Xu, the commanding officer of the troops stationed in Yanhui town, was a widower whose wife had died young and left him no children. He took a fancy to Xu Niang, and soon took her as his second wife. Company Commander Xu was presently leading a contingent of soldiers beyond the border to collect the barbarians' annual tribute. Reckoning the days since he'd set out, he ought to be returning within a day or 2. Life on the border was simple and poor, and the children here rarely enjoyed luxuries like snacks. Whenever the soldiers marched out to collect tribute, they picked up some of the barbarians' dried meats and cheese along the way, which they would then toss into the crowds waiting by the roadside upon their return. This was the phenomenon known as goose feed snatching, wherein street urchins scrambled to fight each other for food like geese for scraps of bread. With all the kids grabbing for prizes at once, it was practically inevitable that the crowd would come to blows. As long as no one got seriously hurt, the adults turned a blind eye, allowing the children to band together and gang up on each other as they pleased. All the kids in town knew this. When it came time for goose feed snatching, whoever won Chang Geng's allegiance was guaranteed a certain victory. Ever since he began learning martial arts as a child, Chang Geng had been meticulous in his practice. Countless military families lived along the border, so there were plenty of children who studied martial arts. But practicing martial arts was a grueling process, so most kids only ever casually dabbled, their sloppy efforts yielding unexceptional results. Chang Geng was the only one who had climbed General Slope daily to train alone since the day he picked up the sword. His years of diligent practice were a testament to his extraordinary determination. Chang Geng had yet to turn 14, yet he could already lift a sword weighing over 30 kilometers with one hand. He was well aware of his capabilities and never took part in the other kids' scuffles. Nevertheless, the other children were all inexplicably a bit scared of him. Chang Geng brushed aside Ge Pangxiao's proposal with a smile. I'm way too old to be chasing after goose feed. Ge Pangxiao refused to back down. I already talked to Shen Shiliu, and he agreed to give us the next few days off. Chang Geng walked slowly with his hands behind his back, the heavy sword bumping against his leg with every stride. Ge Pengxiao's words were childish, and he ignored them. It was his decision whether to study or train with his sword. It didn't matter whether their tutor gave them a day off or not. Besides, continued Ge Pengxiao, Shen Shiliu said he needs to change Uncle Shiliu's medications, and he might have to head out of town to purchase medicinal herbs, so he won't be home anyway. You won't have anywhere to go, so you might as well come with us. Don't you get bored training all day? These words finally caught Chang Geng's attention. He stopped walking and turned to Ge Pengxiao. Didn't Shiliu just get back from Changyang Pass? How did he get sick again? That's what I heard. But then again, he never really gets better, does he? Well, in that case, I'm going to go check on him. Chang Geng waved at his two little tag-alongs and said, Hurry home. It's so late already. Your dad'll beat you if you hold up dinner. Da ge. About the... Chang Geng had no interest in listening to him prattle on. The difference of a single year meant a lot to boys this age when it came to size and maturity. Chang Geng was already beginning to find it difficult to play with little kids like Ge Pengxiao. With his longer stride and taller stature, he left the two younger boys behind in the blink of an eye. Ge Pengxiao's plan to win Chang Geng as an ally was a failure. The plump boy had wasted his time. He sighed in disappointment and turned back to glare at Cao Niangzi. Why didn't you say anything? Cao Niangzi's cheeks were bright red, his gaze drifting. All his bossiness from a moment ago had completely evaporated. Clutching at his chest like a love-struck maiden, he said, Even when he's just walking, my Chang Geng Dake really does look more handsome than anyone else. Speechless, Ge Pengxiao decided at that moment that he would never go out with this embarrassing loser ever again. The Shen Shiliu and Uncle Shiliu of whom Ge Pengxiao spoke were a pair of brothers who shared a somewhat special relationship with Chang Geng. 2 years ago, when Chang Geng was not yet so grown up, he'd snuck out of the city gate by himself to play. In the wilderness outside town, he'd gotten lost and was quickly surrounded by a pack of wolves that would have dragged him away had the Shen brothers not luckily passed close by. The pair saved his life, driving away the starving wolves using the medicinal powder they carried. To thank them for saving Chang Geng's life, Company Commander Xu leased the brothers one of his empty courtyards free of charge, and the two settled down in Yanhui town. The elder of the two was called Shen Yi. He was a failed scholar who had flunked the imperial examination multiple times. Although still quite young, he had long given up his political aspirations and accepted his lot in life as a recluse in a backwater town. All the neighbors politely referred to him as Shen Shiliu. In addition to being a recluse, Shen Shiliu also worked as a doctor, scribe of letters and poetry, teacher, artificer, and countless other occupations. A jack of all trades. Not only could he treat all sorts of sprains, fractures, and contusions, he could also deliver a foal from a pregnant mare. During the day, he managed his own private school, where he taught a gaggle of the town's youngsters how to read and write. After dismissing his students in the evening, he would roll up his sleeves and repair steam engines, steal suits of armor, and all sorts of puppets to supplement the household's living expenses. For a recluse, he was awfully busy. On top of being both breadwinner and homemaker for his family of 2, Shen Shiliu was also an excellent cook. He was tremendously capable, and as a consequence, his brother had nothing left to apply himself to except bringing the family's fortunes to ruin. Shen Shiliu's brother was called Shen Shiliu. He had been sickly since birth, and fearing that he wouldn't live past childhood, his family never bothered to give him a proper name. Since he was born on the 16th day of the first month, they gave him the name Shiliu, 16. Shiliu spent his days neither studying nor working. He didn't even stand oil bottles back up when they tipped over, and no one had ever witnessed him so much as lift a bucket of water. If he wasn't strolling carelessly about, then he was drinking wine. In short, He was deeply ignorant and totally incompetent, and there was almost nothing good about him, aside from being good looking. But he really was very good looking. The town's most venerable elders had personally appraised him, agreeing that in all their nearly 90 years on this earth, they had never seen a man with such perfect features. The pity was, no matter how good looking he might be, it was all a waste. Shen Shiliu had suffered a bout of grave illness as a child, and the fever left him permanently impaired. His weak eyes could only make out objects within half a meter with any clarity. At 10 steps away, he wouldn't be able to tell if a person was a man or a woman. He was also hard of hearing. To speak with him, one couldn't avoid yelling, and every day, when Chang Geng passed by the Shun's front door, he could hear the gentle and refined Shen Xiansheng barking at Shiliu like a mad dog. Put bluntly, Shen Shiliu was a blind and deaf invalid. Given his handsome face, he should have, by all rights, been a pretty boy favored by heaven itself. Unfortunately, in a border town, whether one was a demon or a god, everyone was one thing: poor. Even if an immortal heavenly beauty were to descend on Yanhui town, no one here had the means to provide for them. In these border towns, there was a local custom for occasions when great debts of gratitude could not be repaid. To show your heartfelt thanks, a recipient of a good deed would recognize their benefactor by calling them godparent. Those with children or grandchildren would declare their progeny the godchild of their benefactor. Those without children would assume the responsibility of this filial duty themselves. Studying all those books must have addled Shen Xiansheng's brain, for when it came time to accept repayment for rescuing a wayward child, he stubbornly insisted that such a relationship violated ceremonial rites and refused any such arrangement. Surprisingly, it was his brother, Master Shiliu, who joyfully accepted, immediately warming to his new role and calling Chang Geng son. So, it was that the wastrel Shen Shiliu gained an enormously unfair advantage. Even in the event that this lazy invalid fell into wretched poverty, Chang Geng would be obligated to provide for his godparents' needs for the rest of his life and settle matters after his death. Striding through the courtyards of his home with easy familiarity, Chang Geng took a turn just beyond the corner gate and promptly arrived at Shen Xiansheng's residence. The Shen family was made up of 2 bachelors. They didn't even keep a female hen, so there was no need for any particular propriety. Chang Geng came and went as he pleased without even bothering to knock. Stepping across the threshold, he was at once assaulted by the strong scent of medicine, coupled with the gossamer thin sound of a round-bodied Shun. Shen Xiansheng stood in the courtyard decocting medicinal herbs with a scowl on his face. A scholarly young man, he was dressed in a long robe faded and frayed with age. He wasn't old, but he had a perpetual frown and was enveloped by an air of impoverished mundanity. As for the sound of the flute, it came from inside the house. A lamp cast the slender shadow of its player dimly upon the window's paper screen. The Shun player's skills left much to be desired. Chang Geng couldn't even make out a tune, and every now and then a handful of notes were unceremoniously dropped from existence. Though barely audible, the entire piece filled the small courtyard with a peculiar air of desolation and weariness. It was a bit of a stretch to call this music. After listening a while, Chang Geng felt that if he were pressed to pay the player a compliment, he could only say that, for a performance of funeral wailing, it was remarkably restrained. At the sound of approaching footsteps, Shen Yi turned to smile at Chang Geng, then yelled into the house, "Hey, Grandpa, please have some mercy on the rest of us. Are you trying to make us pee our pants? Chang Geng's here." The Shun player turned a deaf ear. Granted, with his auditory powers, it was possible he simply hadn't heard. After listening to him go on for some time, Chang Geng felt that the Shun player was fairly energetic and didn't seem to be sick. Relieved, he asked, "I heard that Gepang Xiao and Xianshang is changing Shiliu's prescription. What's wrong with him?" Shen Xianshang appraised the medicinal broth with a discerning eye and groused, Nothing's wrong with him. Change of season, that's all. The 4 seasons each require a different prescription. This patient is very finicky and difficult to care for. Oh, right. It's just as well that you're here. I'm not sure where he managed to get it, but he was planning on delivering it to you first thing tomorrow morning. Go in and take a look. Chapter 2. Godfather. Chang Geng picked up the medicine and stepped into his young godfather's room. The only source of light in Shen Shiliu's room was a gloomy little oil lamp. It gave off a pea-sized halo of light, like a firefly's glow. The room's owner sat leaning against the window with his face submerged in shadow, the lamplight revealing only the faintest hint of his features. Because he was about to go to bed, Shen Shiliu hadn't bothered to tie up his hair, leaving his long locks unbound in a disheveled mess. Both the outer corner of his eye and his earlobe were marked with a tiny cinnabar mole, as if he had been pricked by a needle. All the meager light in the room seemed to converge on that delicate pair of beauty marks. They flared with such brightness they nearly burned the eyes. In the lamplight, this man seemed even more alluring than usual. It was only natural to love beauty. Even though Chang Geng was used to it by now, he still couldn't help but catch his breath. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision of those glaringly bright beauty marks. Clearing his throat, he raised his voice and called, "Shiliu, it's time to take your medicine." The youth was at a stage in his life where his voice was still deepening, so he often had to strain a little while speaking to this half-dead man. Luckily, Shen Shiliu heard him this time, and the bladder-stimulating sound of the shun came to an abrupt stop. Shen Shiliu squinted slightly, barely making out Chang Geng's face. "Cheeky brat. What did you call me just now?" He was, in truth, only 7 or 8 years older than Chang Geng and as yet unmarried. Perhaps due to an inkling of self-awareness regarding his own ineptitude, Shen Shiliu was fully prepared to spend the rest of his life in impoverished bachelorhood. It was no easy task encountering this son he conveniently didn't have to raise, and so eager was he to attach himself firmly to the boy that he would lean into his role as Chang Geng's dad at every opportunity. Chang Geng ignored him and carried the bowl of medicine carefully over. "Make sure you drink this while it's hot. It's getting late. Once you're done taking your medicine, you should hurry and go to bed." Shen Shiliu set aside the shun and accepted the bowl. "You ingrate. Is being my son really so bad? My kindness is wasted on you." He struggled not at all with the bitterness of the medicine. Clearly, he was long accustomed to the taste. He downed the bowl in a single gulp. He took a few sips of the water Chang Geng handed him, rinsing his mouth, before waving a hand to indicate that he'd had enough. "There was a market over at Chang Geng Pass today. I got you something interesting. Come here." Shen Shiliu bent down and began rummaging through the hideous mess spilling across his desk. Unable to see clearly, he bent so far over that his nose nearly brushed its flat surface. Chang Geng could only say with helpless exasperation, "What are you looking for? I'll find it for you." Then, a moment later, he couldn't help but grumble, "I'm practically grown already. Why do you keep giving me toys for little kids? While you're at it, why don't you cause a little less trouble so I have more time to learn practical things?" The rest of Chang Geng's words swirled around in his head, but by the time they reached the tip of his tongue, he felt they were a little hurtful, so he left them unsaid. As a libertine and reprobate who couldn't tell his head from a hole in the ground, it was bad enough that Shen Shiliu wasted his own time on worthless pursuits. Yet he also insisted on constantly dragging Chang Geng along with him. If he wasn't summoning him to visit the market, then he was hauling him off to ride horses. Once he even gave Chang Geng a puppy he'd picked up somewhere. This time, Shen Xiansheng's face had nearly turned white with fright. Thanks to his inability to distinguish between wolf and dog, the blind man had carried home a little wolf pup. Company Commander Xu was rarely home. He was also a reserved man, so even though he treated Chang Geng well, his interactions with his stepson were few and far between. Looking back, Chang Geng had spent the majority of the critical time between the ages of 12 and 13 at the side of his unreliable godfather, Shen Shiliu. Just how much focus did it take for an ignorant child to avoid being led astray by Shen Shiliu and instead grow up into a self-assured and dignified youth? Chang Geng simply couldn't bear to reflect on his memories. It went against his nature to run off and play. He planned all his actions and was hard on himself when he set his mind to something. He disliked being disturbed by others and was always deeply annoyed by Shen Shiliu's meddling. But his anger rarely persisted. After all, Shen Shiliu didn't use his status as Chang Geng's grandfather solely to win arguments against the boy. He genuinely loved him like a son. One year, Chang Geng fell gravely ill, and the doctor pronounced his condition dire. As usual, Company Commander Xu was away. It was his young godfather who carried him home and stayed by his bedside for 3 days and nights without rest. Every time his godfather Shiliu left the house, regardless of how far he traveled or what business he had, he would bring back a little toy or some snacks for Chang Geng without fail. Chang Geng had no love for trinkets, but he couldn't help but love the man whose heart was constantly preoccupied with his welfare. Every time Chang Geng saw Shiliu, he felt abnormally irritable, as if a fire was burning in his gut. But when he didn't see him, he worried about him incessantly. There were also times when Chang Geng considered that even though Shen Shiliu was incapable of manual labor and a failure at both the literacy and martial arts, it was still possible that sooner or later some poor fool might fall for his face. Eventually, his godfather would take a wife and raise a family. Would he still concern himself with the godson once he had children of his own? At this thought, Chang Geng's heart suddenly constricted. Spotting a square box sitting amid the disorder on Shiliu's desk, he shook off the wild scenarios racing through his mind and handed it to Shen Shiliu with obvious disinterest. "Is this it? It's for you. Go on. Open it and take a look." Maybe it was a slingshot, or perhaps a packet of cheese. Either way, it definitely wasn't anything respectable. Chang Geng dutifully opened the box, scolding on instinct. "Even if you're well off, you shouldn't spend money so carelessly. Plus, it's not like I..." His mouth snapped shut when he saw what was inside, his eyes growing 2 sizes in an instant. Lying inside the box was an iron cuff. Iron cuffs were part of the light armor used by the military. Since they were worn on the wrist, they were convenient to carry, and were oftentimes removed from the armor and used on their own. The cuffs were typically 10 centimeters wide and could conceal 3 or 4 small knives. These knives, also known as silk darts, were made via a special process that rendered them as thin as cicada wings. It was said that, when fired from an iron cuff using its spring mechanism, the most expertly crafted silk darts could split a single hair from a dozen meters away. Chang Geng was pleasantly surprised. "Where did you get this?" "Shh! Don't let your Shen Yi hear you," Shen Shiliu cautioned. "This is no toy. If he sees it, he'll start banging on again. Do you know how to use it?" Shen Xianshang was currently watering the flowers in the courtyard. As someone with fully functioning oral faculties, he could hear the conversation inside the room with perfect clarity. He really had no idea what to do with this hearing-impaired man who projected his own limitations onto others. Having learned how to dismantle an entire steel suit of armor from Shen Yi, Chang Geng equipped the iron cuff with practiced hands. It was then that he discovered the unique features of this particular weapon. It took immense skill to forge silk darts. These weapons rarely appeared among the common folk, and those that did were second-hand goods that trickled down from the army. The cuffs were also usually made to fit full-grown adult men. Yet the one Shen Shiliu had presented to Chang Geng was uncommonly small, its dimensions perfectly suited for a youth. Seeing Chang Geng's dazed stare, Shen Shiliu knew exactly what he wanted to ask. "The sailor said it's a defective product," he explained evenly. "There's nothing wrong with it, but it's a little on the small side. No one's ever showed any interest in buying it, so I got it at a discount. I can't use it either, so it's yours. Just be careful not to hurt anyone." Chang Geng beamed with rare delight. "Thank you so much." "And who are we thanking?" Shen Shiliu prompted. "Yifu!" Chang Geng cried happily. You little scoundrel. If someone gave you milk, you'd call them Mom. Slinging an arm around Chang Geng's shoulder, Shen Shiliu laughed and led him toward the door. Go on and run home. You shouldn't be wandering around late at night during the ghost month. Only then did Chang Geng remember that it was the 15th day of the 7th month, the very day of the ghost festival. He passed through the corner gate and walked back to his house. As he stepped through the doorway, he realized that the song Shen Shiliu had been playing on the shun was familiar. Granted, the pitch was completely off, but it vaguely resembled the tune from A Westward Send-Off, a dirge often sung at funerals by mourners weeping before a grave. Was that to honor the occasion? Chang Geng wondered in silence. After seeing Chang Geng out, Shen Shiliu spent a long while with his head bowed before he finally managed to make out the shape of the threshold. He carefully stepped over the door sill and closed the gate behind him. Shen Xianshang, who had been waiting for him in the courtyard, took him by the elbow and guided him into the house with a blank expression. An iron cuff made from top-quality black iron with 3 silk darts personally forged by Master Qiu Tianlin himself, Shen Xianshang said. And since the master's death, this particular model has been discontinued indefinitely. What priceless defective products indeed. Shiliu didn't respond. Enough already, Shen Xianshang continued. Stop playing dumb with me. Do you really intend to raise him as your son? Of course. I like that kid. He's righteous and kind, Shiliu finally spoke up. Most likely that is a certain someone's intention as well. If I really did end up adopting him in the future, those other folks would be able to relax. His life would be easier too. Wouldn't that be a win for everyone? Shen Xianshang fell silent. After a spell, he said quietly, You need to make sure he doesn't hate you first. Aren't you even slightly worried? Smiling, Shen Shiliu hiked up the hem of his robe, pushed the door open, and stepped into his room. With a despicable expression on his face, he said, There are plenty of people who hate me. What's one more? That night, as lanterns floated downriver, the souls of the departed drifted their way back home. In the dark of early morning before the 5th night watch, Chang Geng awoke in a restless heat. His back was clammy with a thin film of sweat, and his undergarments were sticky and wet. Even young boys who had someone to guide them through this aspect of adolescence often met it with panic and confusion. Yet Chang Geng was neither panicked nor confused, but strangely indifferent. He sat in a daze for several seconds before rising to clean up with an air of apathy and the slightest hint of disgust on his face. He went out and fetched a tub of cold water. After scrubbing his maturing body from head to toe, he grabbed a neat stack of folded clothes from beside his pillow and got dressed. He reached for a cup of tea he had left out the night before and drained it in a single gulp, then commenced his studies as usual. Chang Geng didn't know what others' first experiences were like, but in his case, he didn't actually have an erotic dream. He had dreamed of a heavy snowstorm beyond the pass. The air was so cold it could freeze someone to death. That day, it was as though the wind had grown a layer of white fur as it whipped past with merciless violence. The blood from his wounds hardly spilled out before it was frozen into shards of ice. The snarls of wolves drew closer and closer, yet their cold, dulled noses couldn't detect the coppery scent of blood. Every inhale delivered only a gasp of salty, sweet, bone-chilling air. Chang Geng's arms and legs were frozen, yet his lungs burned with fire. He was certain he'd be torn to pieces in the snow with no body left to find. But it didn't happen. When he came to, he found himself wrapped in a large coat and carried in a stranger's arms. He remembered that person's collar had been snow white, and their body smelled faintly of bitter medicine. When they saw he was awake, they asked no questions, but merely produced a pot of wine and fed him a mouthful. Chang Geng didn't know what kind of wine it was, and he had never tasted it again since. Back then, his only thought had been that it was even stronger than the baijiu from beyond the pass. It felt like a ball of fire rolling down his throat, a single swallow igniting all the blood in his body. That person was Shiliu. The dream was so clear. It felt as though Shiliu's arms were still wrapped around his body. Chang Geng had spent many hours pondering it, But he remained perplexed. Wasn't that man an invalid? How could his arms be so steady and strong in that terrifying landscape of ice and snow? Chang Geng glanced down at the iron cuff encircling his wrist. He didn't know how it was made, but despite being pressed against his body for an entire night, it hadn't warmed up at all. Availing himself of the cold iron's chill, Chang Geng waited quietly for his agitated heart and raging blood to slow. Sneering slightly, he flung the ridiculous idea that he might have had a wet dream about his godfather out of his mind, lit a lamp, and set about his studies in earnest. At the moment, there came a deep rumble far off in the distance, shaking the ground and the tiny room with it. Chang Geng started in surprise before he remembered. Counting the days, it was about time for the giant kite that had gone on patrol north of the border to return. The giant kite was a large ship over 1,500 meters long. A pair of wings made up of thousands of fire pinions emerged from the sky. When the giant kite took flight, these pinions expelled a dreamy sea of billowing white steam, as high as a surging tide. Each fire pinion was inset with a rice bowl-sized chunk of violet gold that glimmered with reddish-purple light as it burned within the shroud of mist. At first glance, the ship looked like a city of twinkling lights. The northern barbarian tribes surrendered and began paying tribute to Great Liang 14 years ago. Since then, a dozen or so giant kites would set sail from each of the major border towns on the 15th of the first month every year to patrol the north. The flight of the great kites was a deliberate show of might. They sailed predetermined routes across the sky, observing every movement of the barbarians in minute detail from above. In addition to performing functions of deterrence and inspection, the giant kites also transported the annual tribute gifts from each of the northern barbarian tribes back to the imperial court. Chief among these tributes was violet gold. When a single giant kite fully loaded with nearly 500,000 kilograms of violet gold returned to port, even its footsteps sounded several times heavier than when it left. The explosive sounds of fire pinions expelling air as the kite cleaved through the sky were audible several dozen kilometers away. The giant kites had embarked on their northern patrols during the first month of the year. Now, as the molten heat of the 7th month passed its peak, they returned home. Chapter 3. Famous General. The Shu family forebears had passed down a bit of land to their descendants. That, combined with the fact that Company Commander Shu was from a military family, meant he was considered well off by local standards. Though his household was meager, they had the means to hire a maidservant to do the cooking, cleaning, and other domestic tasks. The Shu family's old kitchen maid slowly finished preparing breakfast as the sky began to lighten. She knocked on the door of Chang Geng's study. "Young master," she said, "the madam asked whether you would be joining her in her room for breakfast." Chang Geng was completely absorbed in practicing his calligraphy, but when he heard this, his hands stilled. Then, just as always, he said, "I'll pass. She likes peace and quiet, so I wouldn't want to bother her. Please send along my greetings and let her know I hope she's doing well." The old kitchen maid was unsurprised by his response. This daily question and answer session between the mother and son was a routine affair. But honestly, it was strange. Company Commander Shu was nothing more than a stepfather, while Chang Geng and Xunyang were related by blood. Yet, it was only during the handful of days when Company Commander Shu resided at home that this mother and son put on a pantomime of parental compassion and filial piety. Only then did Chang Geng come to eat at the same table and greet his parents in the mornings and evenings. The moment the master left the house, their relationship became colder and more distant than strangers. They ignored each other's existence entirely, despite living under the same roof. Chang Geng didn't even use the front gate, choosing instead to enter and exit by the corner gate every day as he went next door. It wasn't unusual for weeks to go by without mother and son crossing paths. Even the year Chang Geng suffered that perilous illness, Xunyang showed no concern and only paid him a brief visit. She cared not a whit whether her only son lived or died. Instead, it had been Master Shiliu who carried the child home and nursed him back to health. The old kitchen maid always wondered whether perhaps Xiuniang wasn't Chang Geng's birth mother, but the mother and son bore such a strong physical resemblance that they were most certainly related by blood. Besides, would a delicate, defenseless woman who could barely protect herself as she wandered so far from home continue looking after this child if she hadn't given birth to him? It didn't make any logical sense. The old kitchen maid brought a partitioned box laden with food to Chang Geng. It seems the master will be back in town today. The madam requests that you return home early. Chang Geng knew what she meant. With Company Commander Xu back, they would have to perform the whole song and dance as usual. He nodded. I understand. As Chang Geng's eyes fell upon the box of food, he noticed a long strand of hair sullying its handle. He immediately withdrew the hand he had extended to accept the box. The old kitchen maid's hair had already gone white, so this long strand of soft black hair was not hers. Company Commander Xu had yet to return, so between the family and the servants, there were only 3 living souls. If the hair didn't belong to the old kitchen maid, it could only belong to Xiuniang. Chang Geng had a peculiar obsession with cleanliness, one that only applied to Xiuniang. He was perfectly fine eating leftovers from his godfather's bowl when he dined next door, but when he was at home, he refused to take so much as a bite out of anything Xiuniang had touched. The old kitchen maid was aware of this quirk of his character and hastily removed the strand of hair. Smiling apologetically, she said, "This was accidentally left behind on the box by the maiden. Please rest assured, no one has touched the pastries since I took them out of the oven." Chang Geng smiled politely back at her. Of course. It just so happens that I have a few questions I need to ask Shen Shiliu today. I'll head over to my Yifu's house to eat later. In the end, he refused to take the food. Collecting his books, he tucked them under his arm, grabbed his sword from where it hung behind the door, and left without another word. Next door, Shen Shiliu stood in the courtyard with his sleeves rolled up. He was in the middle of oiling several disassembled suits of steel armor. This armor had been sent from the garrison soldiers. The troops stationed at Yanhui town had their own artificers who specialized in maintaining military armor, but there was so much equipment that they always had their hands full. Thus, they also recruited artificers from among the civilians to help out as needed. Artificers were tradesmen who spent all their time fixing armor and engines or dealing with those big iron fellows. They could technically be considered craftsmen, but to ordinary folks, theirs was a lowly profession no different from a doorkeeper, pedicurist, or barber. Although those who chose this occupation never had to worry about putting food on the table, it wasn't a particularly reputable job. It was difficult to say what drew a scholarly man like Shen Shiliu to such an odd occupation. Not only did he enjoy fiddling around with gadgets in his spare time, he often stooped to dabbling in the trade to earn some pocket change. Shen Shiliu, that inadvertent trespasser in teenage dreams, was presently sitting on the threshold with his long legs outstretched and his body slumped bonelessly against the doorframe. An empty medicine bowl rested beside him. He didn't even know to wash it out after using it. Stretching lethargically, Shiliu waved a listless hand at Chang Geng as he entered and commanded, "Son, fetch me a jar of wine." "Ignore him," Shen Shiliu said to Chang Geng. His hands were streaked with engine grease, and he was drenched in sweat. "Have you eaten?" "Not yet." Shen Shiliu turned to bark at Shiliu. "All you've done since getting up this morning is loaf around and wait to be fed. Can't you make yourself useful? Go wash rice and make us some congee." Shen Shiliu tilted his head to the side, affecting the perfect degree of deafness as he said in an exasperatingly even tone, "Huh? What?" "I'll do it." Chang Geng was accustomed to this. "Which rice should I use?" This time, Shiliu heard him. Raising his long, slender eyebrows, he said to Shen Shiliu, "Stop ordering the kid around. Why don't you do it?" Shen Shiliu was a gentle and refined scholar, but every day his ruinous scoundrel of a younger brother infuriated him so much his entire face seemed to blaze with holy fire. Didn't we agree to take turns? It's not your fault you can't hear, but as a grown man, why do you never keep your word? Trotting out the same old trick, Shen Shiliu once again failed to hear and turned to Chang Geng. What's he yapping about? Chang Geng was speechless. Honestly, being deaf was remarkably convenient. He said... Chang Geng dropped his head down and met Shiliu's playful gaze head-on. For a split second, scenes from last night's dream flashed before his eyes. He suddenly realized that he wasn't as indifferent as he thought. Chang Geng's throat went a bit dry. He composed himself hastily and said with a blank expression, "You'd better sit still, old man. Don't act so shameless first thing in the morning." Shen Shiliu hadn't had time to drink himself into a stupor yet today, so what little consciousness he retained had yet to be soaked into draft. Beaming, he grabbed Chang Geng's hand and used it to pull himself to standing. He patted the youth intimately on the back of the head and trotted unsteadily into the kitchen. Surprisingly, he really was getting ready to work. This was a rare phenomenon, witnessing Master Shiliu doing something productive, an uncommon occurrence comparable to flowers blossoming on an iron tree. Chang Geng hurried in after him, only to see his godfather strut over and carelessly grab a handful of rice, which he tossed into a pot. With a series of splashes, he ladled some water to wash the rice, splattering wet droplets everywhere in the process. Then he deigned to stick 2 fingers in the pot, stirring briefly before pulling them out and flicking off beads of water. "The rice has been half washed," he announced. "Now, get over here, Shen Yi. It's your turn." Shen Xianshang couldn't think of a thing to say. Shen Shiliu grabbed the jar of wine sitting atop the stove with a sweep of his hand and tipped his head to take a large swig. His movements were as smooth as drifting clouds and flowing water, perfectly precise in execution. Sometimes, Chang Geng suspected that even his grandfather's supposed blindness was fake. Perhaps Shen Xianshang had given up. He resigned himself to his fate and washed his hands with a chunk of honey locust soap, cursing the whole time. He darted into the kitchen to set up a steamer basket for the pastries and began to clean up the mess Shiliu left behind. Meanwhile, Chang Geng took out the pieces of calligraphy he had traced earlier that morning and showed them to Shen Xianshang one by one. As Shen Yi finished providing his commentary, Chang Geng stuffed each sheet of paper into the stove to feed the fire. "I can tell that you've been working hard recently. Your writing has improved quite a bit," Shen Xianshang said. "I see you've been tracing a rubbing of the Marquis of Anding Guyuan's roadside pavilion inscription." "Mm-hmm," Chang Geng affirmed. Shiliu had been idling at the side, but upon hearing this, he turned around. An odd expression flickered across his face. Shen Xianshang's head remained bowed. The Marquis of Anding was 15 years old when he led his first troops and made his name with a single battle. At the age of 17, he assumed command of the Western Campaign. As the army passed by a resting place on the outskirts of Xiliang City, he saw the ancient remains left behind by our forefathers. Although it has been over a century since the founding of our great nation, we can still look upon the scenery of previous dynasties. Moved by this thought, he wrote Rhapsody on the Roadside Pavilion. The poem would have been quickly forgotten if some bootlickers among his ranks hadn't secretly saved it and had it inscribed on a stele. Guyuan received personal instruction in calligraphy from the greatest scholar of our time, Mosun Xiansheng, so there are certainly merits to be gleaned from studying his penmanship. However, he was very young when he wrote the Rhapsody on the Roadside Pavilion. Having achieved such momentous success at such a young age, he inevitably had a rather exaggerated and immature opinion of his own abilities. There are so many rubbings of ancient inscriptions you could copy if you want to practice your right. Why did you choose a living person's inscription? Chang Geng rolled up the ink-covered paper and shoved it remorselessly into the fire. "I heard that under the former Marquis's command, the Black Iron Battalion's Black Hawk, Black Carapace, and Black Steed divisions wiped out the 18 barbarian tribes. Later, when his son inherited his title and command, the battalion forced the surrender of the raiders in the western regions. It's not that I like his calligraphy especially. I was just curious to see the handwriting of the commander of the Black Iron Battalion. Shen Shiliu continued mechanically stirring the pot with a ladle in his hand, but his eyes drifted away. After a long moment, he said slowly, "The Marquis of Anding's given name is Gu Yuan. The courtesy name given to him when he came of age is Zixi. He is the only son of the late emperor's eldest daughter and the former Marquis of Anding. His parents died when he was still a child, so His Majesty took pity on him and raised him in the imperial palace. His Majesty also conferred a special title of nobility on him. As a born aristocrat, he could have spent his days idling away in riches and comfort, yet he insisted on going to the western regions to feast on sand. I don't know if I'd call him a hero. There might very well be a screw or two loose in his head." Shen Shiliu was wearing an old robe stained at the hem with armor grease and faded white from too many washes. An unfortunate-looking apron hung from his neck. The brothers scraped by a day at a time without a single woman in the house, each man more disgraceful than the next one. As for the apron, it was difficult to say whether it had been washed even once since falling into their hands. The garment's original color was impossible to make out, and it looked entirely out of place wrapped around Shen Shiliu's body. Only his face was well defined. Shen Yi had a high nose bridge, so when he stopped joking around, his profile had a cold and almost menacing aura. With a twitch of his eyelids, he said, "Since the former Marquis passed away, the Black Iron Battalion has achieved too many great things. It makes those in power uneasy. Add to this the fact that there are too many sycophantic courtiers eager to curry favor with His Majesty running amok." Shen Yi! He was interrupted suddenly by Shiliu, who had been quiet all this time. The pair standing by the stove looked over at him in unison. Shiliu was examining a tiny cobweb hanging from the door frame. He wasn't the type to flush with wine. Rather, his face seemed to turn paler the more he drank. What little emotion he possessed seemed to pool in his eyes, and it was difficult to read his mood. "Don't talk nonsense," he said softly. The Shen brothers never placed much importance on seniority. The younger frequently disrespected the elder, while the elder went to extremes doting on the younger. They spent every day quarreling from morning till evening, but they were always very affectionate toward each other. Chang Geng had never heard Shiliu speak with such severity. The boy was a naturally sensitive person. Though he didn't understand what was going on, he frowned deeply. Shen Yi gritted his teeth for a moment before noticing that Chang Geng was watching him. Restraining his emotions with difficulty, he said with a smile, "Excuse me for misspeaking, but isn't slandering the imperial court the perfect small talk to accompany a meal? I was just saying." Sensing the awkwardness in the air, Chang Geng cleverly changed the topic. "So then, who was in charge of the Black Iron Battalion in the 10 years between the Northern Expedition and the Western Campaign?" "No one," Shen Yi said. "Things were quiet with the Black Iron Battalion for a while. Some soldiers left, others died. Most of the veterans who continued to serve grew disheartened at being left to languish. Over the course of a decade, the elite troops of the old had long been replaced with the new generation of soldiers. What's more, their equipment hadn't seen an upgrade in years and had become completely obsolete. That was the situation until a few years ago, when the rebellion broke out in the western regions. In their time of crisis, the imperial court was left with no other choice. They allowed the Marquis of Anding to take the reins and revive the Black Iron Battalion. Rather than saying that Marshal Gu led the Black Iron Battalion, it would be more accurate to say he forged a new cadre of elite troops in the western regions. If you have the opportunity, you may try studying his current calligraphy." Chang Geng was a bit taken aback. Could it be that Shen Shiliu has seen later writings of the Marquis of Anding? Shen Yi smiled. "It's exceedingly rare, but every now and then you'll see a scroll or two in the bookshops that claim to be his authentic writings. Whether they're real or not is not something I can discern." As he spoke, he blew at the white steam emanating from the cooking pot, then began carrying food over to the table. Chang Geng tactfully stepped forward to help, But as he brushed past Shen Shiliu with the kanji, the invalid's hand shot out to grasp his shoulder. Chang Geng had hit a growth spurt early and was taller and bigger than most boys his age. Although his body had yet to fill out, he was already nearly as tall as his young godfather and could look directly in Shiliu's eyes with the slightest lift of his chin. Shiliu had a pair of quintessential peach blossom eyes, gently curved with the outer corners tilting subtly upward. But their alluring shape was only noticeable when his gaze softened and flitted this way and that. That was because whenever his eyes were focused, it was as though his pupils contained a pair of mist-shrouded chasms so dark they were fathomless. Chang Geng's heart tripped in his chest. Dropping his voice, he deliberately reached for that moniker he so rarely used. Yifu, what's wrong? You're just a kid, so stop daydreaming about becoming a hero. Shiliu said absent-mindedly. Do heroes ever get happy endings? As long as you have food to eat and clothes to wear, as long as you can sleep without worrying about the next day, that's already the best life you can possibly live. Even if it's boring, even if you're hard up, you'll be okay. Shiliu spent most of his time pretending to be deaf and mute, and very rarely uttered anything of value. Now he'd finally opened his mouth just to rain on Chang Geng's parade. As a half-blind, half-deaf cripple, it was only natural for this man to lack ambition and drive. But how could a young boy bear to listen to such resigned, demoralizing talk? Chang Geng felt that Shiliu was looking down on him. Disgruntled, he thought, if we all fritter away our time like you, who will support the household in the future? Who will care for you and make sure you have food to eat and clothes to wear? It's much easier said than done. Ducking out from under Shiliu's hand, he said shortly, Stop messing around. You'll burn yourself on the kanji. Chapter 4. Giant Kite. The Shen family wasn't particular about things like not speaking during meals, so while they ate, Shen Shiliu taught Chang Geng a lesson from the Confucianist text Great Liang. He wandered off topic as he talked, eventually meandering all the way to the issue of how to maintain a suit of armor in the winter. He was a syncretist to begin with and advocated for many schools of thought, so he expounded on whatever came to mind. Once, for some inexplicable reason, he'd even treated Chang Geng to an enthusiastic lecture on the prevention of equine plague. That time, even the death master Shiliu couldn't bear it anymore and told him to shut up. As the meal and conversation came to a close, Shen Shiliu, who had yet to speak his fill, began reluctantly clearing up the dishes. I have to finish repairing those suits of heavy armor today. They never maintained them properly, so some of the joints have rusted through. He turned to Chang Geng. I might go out in the afternoon to gather some medicinal herbs. Ge Pang Xiao and the others asked for today off so that they could go play. What about you? What are your plans? I'm going to head over to General Slope and practice, Chang Geng started. Before the words, with my sword, could leave his mouth, Shen Shiliu had already hung Chang Geng's iron sword on the wall and announced, Son, let's go. The giant kite is about to return. We should get in on the fun. Chang Geng protested in vain. Yifu, I was just telling Shen Shiliu that I... Shen Shiliu asked, What was that? Speak louder. Great. There he went again. The giant kite came and went every single year. Chang Geng couldn't imagine what could possibly be any different about this one. But before he could object, Shiliu had already pulled him out of his seat, dragged him from across the room, and shoved him unceremoniously out the door. The summer heat had yet to subside, so everyone was wearing thin garments. Chang Geng could feel Shiliu's whole body press up against his back, enveloping him in a faint medicinal fragrance, just like in his dream. For some inexplicable reason, Chang Geng began to feel uneasy. He furtively lowered his head and shied away from this young godfather, then covered his nose and turned, pretending to sneeze. Grinning brightly, Shiliu teased. There's someone out there thinking of you. Could it be that round-faced little girl from old Wang's house? Chang Geng couldn't hold back his displeasure any longer. Yifu, he said stiffly. Don't you think it's inappropriate to crack these sorts of jokes with your juniors? Shen Shiliu didn't take a word he said seriously. Inappropriate? He smiled mischievously. Ah, well, I've never been a dad before, so I don't know anything about appropriate behavior. I'll be more careful in the future. Anyone who attempted to speak earnestly with Shen Shiliu was guaranteed to end up blowing a fuse. Chang Geng shook off the arm this layabout tried to sling over his shoulder and strode off ahead, leaving Shiliu behind. Behind them, Shun Xiansheng called out in a warning. Shiliu, make sure you come home early and chop the firewood. Shun Shiliu slipped out the door so quickly it was as though his feet had been smeared with oil. Shamelessly, he called back, Can't hear you. See you later. With Shiliu shoving at him from behind, Chang Geng was forced to jog the entire way. When exactly do you actually struggle to hear? He asked. Shen Shiliu merely smiled, his expression profoundly mysterious. Just as the two were passing the front entrance of Chang Geng's home, the gate creaked open. A woman in a long, plain dress stepped out. The moment he saw her, the exasperation on Chang Geng's face froze over. It was as if he had been splashed with a bucket of ice water, drenching him from head to toe. His eyes, which had been burning with barely suppressed anger only seconds ago, were hollow. Whatever spark of life they previously held doused in an instant alongside his ire. This woman was Xiuniang, Chang Geng's mother, if only in name. Although she was no longer young, her loveliness hadn't faded at all. Standing in the first rays of the morning sun, she looked like a gently refined and serene beauty who had stepped out of a painting. Even if she was a widow, it was plainly insulting to send such a woman to the Borderlands to become the wife of an insignificant company commander. Xiuniang nodded a salutation, dipping her body towards Shen Shiliu in a graceful curtsy. Master Shiliu, she said politely. Shen Shiliu only acted disgracefully when he was around Shen Yi. Whenever he encountered women, he transformed into an elegant gentleman, turning slightly to the side to avoid looking directly at Xiuniang's face. He greeted her with impeccable courtesy. Madam Xu, I'm taking Chang Geng out to play. Thank you for your trouble. Xiuniang's... Oh. Thank you for your trouble. Xiuniang's mouth curved slightly in a restrained smile that revealed no teeth. She turned toward Chang Geng. Your father is returning today, she reminded him softly. If you're going out, remember to bring back a box of rogue for me. Her voice was as light as the humming of a mosquito, easily scattered by a single exhale. But before Chang Geng could respond, Shun the Deaf had already beaten him to the punch and agreed on his behalf. Worry not, my lady. You can count on us. Chang Geng had no words. It was at this moment that he arrived at a rough idea of one of his godfather's rules with respect to his deafness. He couldn't hear a single thing Shun Yi said, but with others there was a degree of selectivity. It depended on whether he wanted to hear them or not. When it came to single young ladies who'd come of age and young married women, even if it was the brief buzzing of a female mosquito, he was capable of hearing them without missing a single word. It wasn't enough that he was a lazy glutton. He was also a lecherous skirt chaser. The man's good looks and gentlemanly conduct were a scam. It was as though the expression, all that glitters is not gold, had been coined specifically to describe him. On the day the giant kite returned, gaggles of children waiting to collect goose feed and onlookers from nearby villages all congregated near the town gates. With so many people gathered in one place, it was only natural that enterprising minds would see an opportunity to peddle their wares. Thus, a large market known to the locals as the Gosling Market gradually formed. Shen Shiliu never paid much attention to other people's moods, and even if he did notice, he acted as if he didn't. He gave no indication of having sensed his godson's murky feelings as he wandered enthusiastically back and forth through the overcrowded Gosling Market, utterly fascinated by everything he saw. Despite his consternation, Chang Geng had no choice but to follow closely behind him. He was constantly on high alert lest he lose his godfather in the tight-packed crowd. The world was in a state of turmoil in recent years. The people were poor, and most of the wares on the market were the homemade goods of peasant families. There was nothing good to eat and nothing good to drink. All in all, it was a terribly boring affair. It was commonly held that war was the reason times were lean and taxes increased year by year. But there had been wars in the past, and those wars had always been followed by a period of recovery after the fighting ended. War was over, yet for some reason, in the past few years, the people never seemed to have time to catch their breath. In only 20 years, Great Liang had first launched the northern expedition, then initiated the western campaign. How majestic the country was! A vast empire blessed by the heavens, with emissaries flocking from all corners of the world to pay respect to its great sovereign. Yet somehow, its people only became poorer and poorer. It was truly mystifying. Chang Geng was so bored wandering around the market that he stifled a yawn. He could hardly wait for Shen Shiliu, the country bumpkin fascinated by anything and everything he saw, to finish enjoying himself. He'd much rather assist Shen Xiansheng with his work if it meant he could head back earlier. Shen Shiliu bought a bag of pitch-black salted beans, which he ate as he walked along. As if he sprouted eyes in the back of his head, he reached back with perfect accuracy and shoved a salted bean directly into Chang Geng's mouth. Caught by surprise, Chang Geng accidentally licked his finger and, in his ensuing panic, bit down on the inside of his mouth, immediately drawing blood. Chang Geng hissed with pain and glared furiously at Shen Shiliu, the bane of his existence. Flowers may bloom time and again, but humans can never relive their youth. Shen Shiliu didn't look back. Selecting another bean, he held it up to the sun. His hands were very beautiful, slender and fair. They resembled the hands of the young master of an aristocratic family, fit for holding a scroll or a Wei Qi piece. They seemed completely at odds with such ashy black roasted beans. "You'll understand once you're a little older," Shen Shiliu said sagely. "A person's youth is as tiny and insignificant as this bean. It disappears in the blink of an eye, never to return. Later, you'll realize just how much you squandered on useless endeavors." How Shen Shiliu had the face to speak so shamelessly of squandering time on useless endeavors was completely beyond Chang Geng's comprehension. Just then, a flurry of cheers erupted from the crowd gathered around the town gates. Even someone half-blind could see the giant kite bearing down upon the horizon in the distance. It was back. Countless fire pinions pointed skywards, expelling 1,000 billowy peaks of white steam like a wad of cotton falling from the ninth heaven. The faint outline of an enormous ship's bow emerged from within the expanse of rippling mist. 8 deceptively lifelike flood dragons curled against the side of the ship, glaring with unparalleled disdain as they pushed through the clouds. Starting in surprise, Shen Shiliu turned to listen. The cinnabar mole on his ear flashed with red light. Frowning slightly, he muttered, "Why is the ship so light this year?" The area was filled with the deafening rumble of the giant kite and the cacophonous shouting of the crowd, and this mutter, soft as a sigh, soon disappeared without a trace. Even Chang Geng, who was following close behind, failed to hear it. Children raised their little bamboo baskets and jostled for position as they waited to collect goose feed. A group of soldiers came jogging out onto the town walls in formation, and a messenger stood beside the 10-meter-tall copper squall, awaiting orders. The squall looked like a giant copper horn that had been set on its side atop the town wall. It was covered in a layer of irregularly patterned dark green verdigris resembling decorative scrollwork. The messenger took a deep breath and blew into one end of the copper squall, issuing a long, sustained note. The sound was amplified several dozen times, reverberating unceasingly like a great bell. "The goose has returned! Unseal the river!" The 2 ranks of soldiers grabbed hold of the crank handles on the giant wooden wheel attached to the gate tower. With a collective shout, they all began to push, their rippling muscles on clear display as their naked torsos strained with great effort. As the giant wooden wheel creaked in motion, the limestone walkway below the gate tower split in two. Countless interlocked gears turned, and the bricks on both sides separated. Pulling back in opposite directions, earth split open, revealing the deep underground river that ran under the entirety of Yanhui town. The messenger's somber, drawn-out call echoed forth from the copper squall, its sound penetrating through all in its path before drifting into the distance. There came a responding call from the giant kite. Then, the countless fire pinions burst into action as the surrounding blanket of steam began to swirl furiously. The ship was preparing for landing. The first batch of goose feed fell from the sky like flowers scattered by a celestial maiden. The children below scrambled like mad, all of them reaching out to snatch the food. Sadly, the time allotted for tossing goose feed was all too short. Moments later, the giant kite alighted onto the underground river, landing safely on the surface of the water before the eyes of the crowd. The hull of the ship was terribly forbidding, the cold metal glimmering with a strange, murderous aura. The bulge call that issued from it was indescribably sorrowful, the mournful note reverberating on and on until it resonated throughout the entirety of Yanhui town. It was as though the souls of those who had died in battle over millennia had all awoken from their slumber and joined their voices in song. The giant kite followed the underground river steadily into town, the water splashing loudly against its sides. The voice of the messenger rang out once again. "Extinguish the lights!" The giant kite responded by dousing its fire pinions. A vaguely burnt smell like that of firecrackers permeated the air. As the giant kite rode the current of the river, the dragon's curl along its hull seemed to transform. The beasts became totems froze in time, their figures marked by a wicked divinity. Chang Geng stood in the thronging crowd, watching the giant kite draw nearer. Although he said he didn't want to come, and it was true that he had seen the giant kite return to port on multiple occasions, he still found himself awestruck by the enormous creature when faced with such a scene. If the giant kites dispatched on the northern patrol were this impressive, then how much more magnificent might the nation's greatest weapon, the Black Iron Battalion, be? As a young boy trapped in such a remote corner of the world as Yanhui town, he could scarcely begin to imagine it. As the giant kite approached, Chang Geng's senses were assaulted by the residual heat from the extinguished fire pinions. He reached out to grab the person beside him, warning, "The giant kite's coming. There's way too many people here. Let's step back a bit." There was no response. His hand met empty air. Turning back, Chang Geng realized that his annoying godfather had at some unknown point in time disappeared without a trace. All right, everyone. That concludes the reading of the first 4 chapters of Stars of Chaos, Volume 1. I have to say, so far, I am finding this a little interesting. I can't wait to, get more into it so I can know what's going on. I'm partly interested, partly also a little not, but leaning more towards interested. I don't even know how to explain that feeling right now, but so far I do like Chang Geng. He seems like a nice little kid, and this godfather of his, there's definitely something going on there. There's no way he's deaf and blind. That is clear. So now I'm just like, what secret is it that you're holding? I want to know. Tell me. 告诉我. Anyway, I'll see you guys next time.